So welcome everyone. Just very quickly, my name is Charlotte Moyens. I'm a senior manager with the Strong Cities Network. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with the Strong Cities Network, just very briefly, we are a global network of over 150 cities and other subnational authorities working together to prevent and counter hate and extremism and other related issues at the local level. And at the Strong Cities Network, we really recognize the multifaceted role that cities and other local authorities play in safeguarding communities and individuals from hate and extremism and related challenges. And I guess at the very base of it, we try to support local leaders and practitioners with their efforts to address these issues and challenges. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second in a series of monthly webinars that the Strong Cities Network is hosting over the next year and beyond, and which we really hope will provide a platform for Strong Cities Network members and partners beyond that and other interested stakeholders to engage and share lessons and practices on some of the most pressing issues that face our local leaders and our communities today. Today's webinar explores the issue of anti-minority activism, and we'll start with a presentation of findings from a recent study by the Center for Research and Evidence on Security Threats, or CREST, on the escalation and mobilization to violence in the context of anti-minority activism. And I believe my colleagues will post a link to the study in the chat now or any minute now. And essentially through a cross case study analysis of what are dubbed hot periods of anti-minority activism in the UK, USA, and Germany, researchers sought to explore some of the reasons why physical violence may escalate beyond what might be considered normal levels in some anti-minority protests and not others. And I guess importantly, especially for our network, what that means for local leaders, practitioners, government, and other stakeholders in terms of being able to inhibit instances of violent escalation or respond should it happen. So just to say, as a global network, we recognize that anti-minority activism and other local issues, right? They're all context specific. It'll differ from context to context, whether it's the narratives that drive it, whether it's the nature of the movements, the scope of the movements. There are obviously similarities, but also differences between contexts. That said, we also recognize that cities all around the world, at least across our global membership, grapple with these types of issues in some shape or form, whether it's anti-minority activism, like the topic of today's webinar, whether it's anti-lockdown protests, intercommunal tension more broadly, mobilization against refugees, which is, of course, of particular concern given everything that's happening today, or even outright crisis response, right? Whether it's responding to hate crimes, extremist violence, terrorist violence. It's really cities, by virtue of their close proximity to the communities that are most impacted by these issues, that face the brunt of grappling with these issues, of responding should there be an escalation to violence, but also of having the infrastructure in place to mitigate against risks of violence in the first place. So we really hope that no matter which context that you join us from, that this session provides interesting and relevant takeaways for you and your work. So now for a very quick run of show, we are joined here today by Joel Busher, Research Fellow at the Center for Trust, Peace, and Social Relations at Coventry University, who will kick the session off with a presentation on the research piece that I mentioned and the key findings from this research. Joel is also joined by his co-author, Gareth Harris, an independent researcher and visiting fellow at Coventry University. Following the presentation on the research, we will have a very exciting lineup of speakers of a panel that includes Michael Signer, the former mayor of Charlottesville, Virginia, which is one of the case studies in this research. Michael is joined by Lisbeth van der Heide, head of counter-radicalization and violent extremism in the Security Directorate at the City of The Hague, and by Paul Menz, project coordinator at U-Turn in Dortmund, Germany. Following the panel, we will then open for a Q&A with all of our speakers. So we really encourage you throughout the session to drop questions into the chat or to use the Q&A function that Zoom provides, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen next to the chat button. So without further ado, I will pass to Joel. Joel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Thank you very much, SCN. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I feel very honoured to be sort of sharing this virtual floor with such an experienced and knowledgeable panel. So thank you very much as well to my co-panelists for joining. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the work that Gareth and I carried out with Julia Ebner at ISD, Graham Macklin at CREST in Oslo, and my colleague Sophie Hagsek here at Coventry University. Gareth, as Charlottesville, will chip in at the end as well with some of the Q&A. So we spent sort of 15 years or so, even a bit longer now, observing far-right or anti-minority protests, often in the UK, but sometimes in other parts of the world as well. And much of that time has been spent working very closely with local authorities. I think one of the things that we noticed looking at far-right protests, anti-minority protests, is that often there's not actually that much physical violence. There's lots of bluster, but violence is usually fairly limited in scale, light scuffles, that sort of thing. But occasionally it does escalate, and when it does escalate, it's not just physical harms associated with the violence itself, but there's also issues around the damage to social fabric. So, effects on processes of polarization, the stigma that it can leave on towns and cities, people living in fear. So as part of our ongoing efforts to support people working in policy and practice, we wanted to try to better understand the pathways towards and away from violence during these waves of anti-minority protest, what we refer to as these hot periods of anti-minority protest, and to see whether we could provide some insights that would be relevant then for planning in preparation for and also responding to such activities. So as Charlotte mentioned, we looked at a number of case studies. We looked at 4 case studies, Dover in the UK between October 2014, April 2016, Sunderland in the UK, September 2016 to December 2018, Chemnitz in Germany from August through to December 2018, and Charlottesville in the USA, February through to October 2017. These cases all had very clear potential for violence and became national and international focal points for anti-minority protest and activism. But there are quite different patterns of violence observed in each of the cases, which sort of helps in terms of building theory. We also had quite good access to data for each of the cases, different types of data, but quite good access to data, which meant we could build up a nice sort of detailed picture. So what did we do? So for each of the cases, we based them on a combination of documentary evidence, social media analysis, and also interviews. And we sought to trace the mechanisms that escalated and inhibited violence within each of the cases, and then compared across the cases to see whether we were seeing similar kind of patterns in the different cases. We did all of this using what is called a relational framework. Simply put, that means that we looked at the changing relationships between different sets of key actors within within each of these cases. So we looked within the anti-minority movement in question. We looked at the relationships between anti-minority activists and counter-demonstrators, counter-movement. We looked at the relationships between the movement and political and cultural elites, between the movement and law enforcement actors, and between the movement and the general public. And we did that for each of the cases. In terms of findings, so we ended up with a long list, which is available online, 21 violence escalating and 17 violence inhibiting mechanisms spread across different relational arenas. You'll be relieved to hear I'm not going to go through all of those at this point in time, but what I'm going to do is just to make 4 sort of main points to hopefully sort of set up some of the discussion. Whenever we see instances of significant escalation in any of these cases, there's always 2 parts to the story. Part of that is about situational breakdowns, this idea that the usual choreography of protests somehow breaks down and violence ensues. So that could be the protesters break through a police line, or the protest diverges from what was planned and agreed in advance of the event. So there's something that basically breaks down the choreography and violence happens. However, there are always developments prior to the demonstrations in question that seem to have made those situational breakdowns more likely. So that could be, for example, the emergence of a humiliation and revenge dynamic between activists and counter demonstrators, counter activists. It could be about movement moderates losing control in the build-up to a demonstration, or a belief that there's a critical juncture that can somehow justify an escalation of violence or use of greater violence than would usually be the case. We're all very cautious about using deterministic accounts for simple if A then B kind of narrative about risk, but our research does support the idea that there are things that we can be looking out for that can prime us about rising threat levels, or similarly that can also reassure us that threat levels are relatively low. The implication, we think, is it sort of emphasizes the importance of looking at how event management can actually be integrated into wider strategic planning about managing community relations. The second point is that our research supports the idea that it's important to integrate analysis of violence inhibiting mechanisms into our research when we're trying to analyse, emerging threats. Often we focus only on, if you like, the escalating factors, and we think that these inhibiting mechanisms are important. Why? In part, we get a better explanation of the outcomes when we do that. In each of the cases, there was potential for far greater violence than actually took place. It's only looking at those inhibiting mechanisms that can help us to explain why violence didn't go even further. But also, we think it brings opportunities to identify intervention opportunities. So how can we, in effect, reinforce brakes on violence escalation? The third point, our research emphasises the importance of looking holistically at any conflict if we want to understand emerging threats. So it's not just about what's happening in the movement or between the movement and the counter movement, or even between the movements and law enforcement. It's also about what's going on in political and cultural elites, general public, and how they all interact. That sounds pretty complex and hard to get our heads around. And this is where we think the relational framework can be a useful way of cutting through some of that complexity, and can be particularly relevant if we're thinking about facilitating multi-agency, multi-stakeholder planning and coordination. Fourth and final point, and in some ways, this was the thing that really sort of stood out to us looking at the research, was there seems to be more than one pathway to violence in the case studies that we looked at. We use the terminology of saying there's a movement marginalized pathway and a movement emboldened pathway. In the movement marginalized pathway, we see a disconnection from the public, so the movement disconnects from the public, from the wider political landscape. There's declining influence of moderates within the movement. Strategic concerns about optics and achieving respectability fall by the wayside, and they can spiral towards violence. And the closest we have to this sort of, if you like, ideal type within our cases was what happened in the Dover case. The movement emboldened pathway, within that pathway, what we see is a growing belief within at least part of the movement that they have broader support within the public, among policymakers and so forth, or that they think they're unlikely to be held to account for the violence that they carry out. And the closest we see to that sort of ideal type, if you like, is in Chemnitz. So these are ideal types. Each case is going to have a little bit of both of those pathways, but we think it's useful to have those two pathways in mind. In part, that's about understanding the wider threat that such incidents can pose. We think that the movement emboldened pathway might actually pose a greater societal threat than the movement marginalized pathway. And that's in part because we think it's more likely to feed back into processes of wider societal polarization. But it's also about thinking how different pathways might require slightly different responses, different prioritization of activities. So for example, within the movement emboldened pathway, one of the responses would seem to be prioritizing efforts to undermine a belief that they enjoy that wider support, but that would be likely to have fairly little effect in the movement marginalized pathway. So wrapping up, where are we at now? Well, engaging in conversations like this to explore how this work can be used to support the work of local and national policy planners, and also starting to think about the relevance to other types of protests that we're seeing taking off at the moment. So thank you ever so much again for letting us be part of this meeting.
Thank you so much, Joel. I think what you were saying, especially around the relational dynamics, it's something that corresponds strongly with the work that we try to do with the Strong Cities Network when it comes to developing that multi-actor infrastructure, that holistic infrastructure to put prevention in place. But yeah, we'll get more to that in the Q&A. I'll now pass on to our panel. I'll firstly pass on to Michael Signer, former mayor of Charlottesville, Virginia. Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And again, I will apologize if I sound a little froggy because we are dealing with a very intense allergy season here in Central Virginia, and I am mostly functional right now. However, this is a crucial topic, and I'm really glad to be involved. I want to just parenthetically state at the outset, I think this kind of learning, this peer-to-peer learning, or that, is peer-to-peer learning that's facilitated by a group like Strong Cities Network is absolutely essential as we figure out how to get ahead of these unbelievably alarming trend lines where you're looking at increased civil conflict between these sorts of groups and really profound victimization of vulnerable minority populations, as we saw in Charlottesville. And I think that if you look at this trend line across the United States, looking at the proliferation of these events in very unlikely locations, there are hotspots that are known, like Portland and Berkeley and Seattle, but then there were pop-up events, if you will, in places like Kenosha. And then there were singular targeted events where a lot of the same features that we saw in Charlottesville, like the January 6th insurrection. And so my concern, which is very real, is that there will be a correlation between the increase of these events and the political climate that we see. In the United States, that makes a special sense as you look at the rise of white nationalism and the increased kind of acceleration of polarization over the next couple of years that's likely to come. And we've obviously seen it across Europe for many of the same reasons. So I think that this could not be more timely. And I think that because government and leadership is at the end of the day made up of people, that those people learn best from each other, especially from people who've been through it. So I really applaud and I'm grateful for the role that Strong Cities and ISD are taking in this work. So with that said, I will go through a few thoughts. First of all, it was a mixture of it was very humbling to read my book. You cited so much in the study, but it was that ego stuff wasn't as relevant as I was just glad that in the effort I made in the book to get a lot of facts out that had not been known, as an event like Charlottesville becomes distilled into a series of memes and impressions. It's really important to understand the details. The devil is in the details with how these events can go wrong or how they can be better than wrong. And so it was really nice to see the study, and I encourage everybody to read it, both the final report and the shorter versions, really dive into these important details. And so what I'm going to do here is go through just a couple of simple concepts and then 11 specific takeaways. I ended up at 11 just because that's where I started going, and I'll try to do this in the 10 minutes I'm given. Okay, first question to answer. If you feel like your government is going to be the location of one of these conflicts, have you explained to the public the nature of your government? As in all of these places, from Minneapolis to Seattle to Charlottesville to Washington, D.C., it was the specific interworkings, the internecine interworkings of the different branches of government that became a hugely critical factor in whether, quote unquote, the government had any capacity to plan for and respond to civil conflict. Washington, D.C. is a federal protectorate of the United States government, where there were multiple different security actors, from the Capitol Police, who are under the purview of Congress, to the National Guard, who is under the purview of the president, to the mayor of Washington, who had only limited security control, including not really over the Capitol grounds itself. In Charlottesville, we have a city manager form of government where the mayor, me, was not operationally involved in security because the professional and the operational duties of government are run by a city manager, a full-time city manager. And you had two overlapping jurisdictions, Albemarle County, which is twice as big, which surrounds Charlottesville and where a lot of the white nationalists retreated to after the events, and the University of Virginia, which is a whole other complication. All I'm saying is that it's important to understand and work backward from what your government is. And then within that line of government, within all those government entities, are the lines of authority crystal clear from the outset. And that'll go to some of the themes I'm going to talk about here. Okay, here are the 11 points, takeaways from Charlottesville that I would communicate to anybody in any leadership role, as I have. I work frequently with mayors and other cities who are facing some kind of conflict, and they say, give me 5 minutes, tell me what I should know from Charlottesville. And this is a rough version of what I do. Okay, the first one is, at all costs, whatever the event is going to happen, where there might be some interaction between groups that would conflict, separate them. You have to move heaven and earth to establish green space between the groups that might conflict. And that is the backdoor that gets you into lots of difficult issues around the First Amendment, around ordinances, around who's doing what. But the most important thing is to be clear in your outset, which is to separate the groups with green space between them so that you decrease to hopefully a 0% likelihood the fact that they physically conflict and entangle with each other. Number two, hope for the best, plan for the worst. There is a tremendous amount of concern out there about police appearing in body armor presentation, about the militarization of police, about police being our foes and not our friends. We had that a lot in Charlottesville. The police were attacked by the very far left repeatedly. There was a tremendous amount of mistrust. They used tear gas at one point, which was a huge mistake. I'll get to that in a second. But in my estimation, it is worth, the juice is worth the squeeze if you can establish more security for the police to enable them to do the job of separating the groups. And there's a big difference about whether or not they have body armor and they're able to actually separate people or not. That was a big issue in Charlottesville. You need to equip them for the worst. It's a much better outcome. Number three, establish lines of communication to all sides. One of the things that happened in Charlottesville, and I know that happens in other places, is there's a breakdown of communication where the far left will refuse to talk to, and there are many anarchic and anti-institutional elements in the far left. They will refuse to engage with the police at all. I would draw, if I were a security professional, from the best practices out there for, like working with gangs, where you find trusted interlocutors. It requires very creative thinking, but you must do everything you can to have a line of communication with both groups before, during, and after the event, because that's where the worst stuff happens. When things spin out of control, when somebody is killed, when there's an event after the event that all of a sudden becomes the story and you're scrambling to deal with it. And communication, people having cell phone numbers, knowing who to call, even if you would never have coffee with this person, they need to be able to communicate with the security forces of the government and need to know what the plans are, exit, entry, end of the event, what happens if somebody's hurt. And so do everything you can to do that. Number four is an external facing aspect of this, which is establish lines of communication to the public, over communicate to them, again, before, during, and after the event. We're all humans. It's an era of public life where nobody escapes unscathed. If you're in elective office, if you're hoping to be popular in some durable way, that era ended, I think, unfortunately, with social media. This is a time when a lot of my colleagues who are mayors, police chiefs, they have activists camping out at their houses and disrupting their sleep because of one issue or another. So just factoring in, it's a very fractious, difficult environment for anybody in public life. You need to communicate with the public, and it's not going to be, it'll be awkward, it'll be difficult, it will be more human than your, probably involve very different settings than like a press conference with a, like Vladimir Zelensky is just doing like FaceTime from his office recently. But communicate with the public about what you're dealing with, about what the intelligence is showing, about what your recommendations are. Don't lecture to them, but communicate to them and tell them what's going on. One of the problems in Charlottesville was the communications was basically shut down because of an internecine disagreement between the professional staff and the elected officials. The elected officials wanted like twice daily press briefings. The administrative staff said, we have a whole system in place that we're working with the state, and they basically didn't send out a press release until after everything was done, and the public was out of their minds with anxiety about what was happening in their city and why their government wasn't talking to them. Number five, mine intelligence using the best authorities you can, which in the United States is, unless you're in one of the very biggest cities, which has a intelligence capacity of its own, LA, New York, You have to work with the federal government. We had a tremendous blocker in the case of Charlottesville, which is the federal government at that time, as a lot of reporting has shown, was run by Donald Trump, and white nationalists were part of his political base. So the FBI and the Department of Justice, DHS, for the most part, really disincluded violent white nationalists from the ambit of potential terrorists, and they were not infiltrating them and getting all the intelligence that they could have from where the actual planning for violence was happening, which was on a protected gaming platform called Discord. Those are critical mistakes because the government has a job to keep its people safe. And we have the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Their job is to investigate, and in the United States. So you have to find the intelligence where these people, as long as it's legal, to gather that intelligence, are planning for their worst kind of violence. Number 6, I think this is the most important takeaway from Charlottesville: tabletop, tabletop, tabletop. That is it's a standard practice within our homeland and defense worlds in the US. It means basically sitting around a table and practicing and rehearsing what you will do when the event comes, and practicing again. You iterate so that you know what could go wrong, you know what your roles are. Due to the failure of tabletopping in Charlottesville on the morning of the Unite the Right rally, the state police, who were there with more forces than the local, they literally had a briefing that the local police didn't know about. There were 2 different briefings, and they were actually on different radio frequencies. It kind of boggles the mind, but it is true. So you have to practice and tabletop, lest you have events take you over that you have not planned for. Okay, 4 more here. Focus on, and this is true to the spirit of this report, and I think the whole effort here, which I really applaud, focus on vulnerable communities, identify them and have special plans for them, because their experience of this, it may not be as objective or as fact-based as the government entities want it to be. So in Charlottesville, there's a Black community in an affordable housing area very near these events, which felt extremely vulnerable in a way that was traumatizing for them for years later, by the fact that they had these racists marching right near them. There was not an attack on them, but they felt vulnerable, and they felt like the government had not paid special attention to their needs. Same for the Jewish community. The Jewish community has a synagogue a block away from the Robert E. Lee statue. The Jewish community in Charlottesville has been pretty assimilationist. It's not a especially public synagogue, even though it's right nearby downtown Charlottesville. They had asked, and I had tried to get from the police chief, as the city's Jewish mayor, a full-time security guard in a police car stationed right outside the synagogue, and that was refused by the police force because they thought, well, we're going to have a guard at the end of the block and we'll have snipers on the roofs of the buildings. You are factually protected, but what they didn't attend to was emotional vulnerability. And it wouldn't have cost very much to just have the police car there to show that vulnerable community that the government had designed a plan taking them into account, and they should have done that. All right, number 8, when you design your security plan, do everything you can to remove all potential weapons and do your legal work in advance to enable this. So treat your site like you would a concert where you have to bring in those plastic bags, and now in Charlottesville, you can't even bring in glass bottles once an event, because we rewrote the ordinance and we established a perimeter. If the glass bottles could be broken and used as a weapon, you can't bring them in. That took a tremendous amount of work and recrafting our ordinance consistent with First Amendment law in the United States, but really treat it as a weapon-free zone to the extent you can, and work very hard to enforce that, including all the required signage and ordinance requirements that you have. Number 9, this is a little counterintuitive, but it's important because in the fog of war, the fog of battle, a lot of emotions and egos surge, especially among people vested with command authority. Do not get into turf battles. A lot of the story in these places is there will be a battle over a particular street or an area, or an officer will be repeatedly insulted and they lose their temper. That's the point of a lot of these nihilistic anti-institutional actors. They're there for reasons. In Charlottesville, before the Unite the Right rally, there was another rally with the Ku Klux Klan where, after the Ku Klux Klan left, there was a turf battle where the Antifa activists linked arms across the street. They were furious at the police. They wouldn't yield the street, and the police used tear gas instead of just saying, fine, have the street for 24 hours, we're going to go have a cup of coffee. They got into this battle, which was unnecessary and which ended up creating a whole set of other catastrophes that laid the groundwork for the worst of August 12th. So don't get into turf battles. Time is your friend. Number 10 is, after the crisis happens, deliver accountability. In Virginia, the governor of Virginia, unfortunately, dealt with the complicity of the state forces in a very political way. They kind of did this political commission to investigate. They didn't make documents available. They sort of shifted blame, and it was very political, and it didn't really result in any learning. Whereas the city of Charlottesville, one of the things I was proud of was we commissioned a true independent investigation, which was very rough on everybody, but it included a lot of learning. And the guy who did it later on went to be the chief investigator for the January 6th Commission, named Tim Hafey. So be honest and thorough in searching in your accountability. And finally, I would say plan for and accept and deliver whatever healing will require. There is healing after one of these events. It is in Charlottesville. I live here still now, over 5 years later. There are hundreds of people who are traumatized. There's no way to paint a pretty picture about it. It's ugly and unpleasant and hard and vulnerable, but it's human. And there were hundreds of therapists who offered free services. There was work the city did to create this whole new set of unity and reconciliation days. The healing continues. Some of it came through successful prosecutions. Some of it came through the accountability measures I said. Some of it came through, I don't know, people growing. Traumatic growth is an idea. But I think that to be broad and humane leaders, you have to think about healing afterward and have your eyes on it and really work for it. So those are some of my takeaways, and I really applaud the work that's gone into these important products.
Great, thank you so much. That was very insightful and quite reminiscent of the work that we're doing with the Strong Cities Network on post-incident response, especially around communications and protecting vulnerable groups and so forth. So I'll now pass on to Lisbeth. Lisbeth, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Charlotte, and thank you, Mike, for your both very comprehensive, insightful, but also very practical guidance, I would say. I mean, I was just jotting down the 11 lessons, and I feel like I could sit down with our mayor in The Hague tomorrow to focus on some of the lessons I think we haven't been implementing that well yet. A bit of background as to why I am sharing my perspective here from the city of The Hague. As you maybe have read, I am heading the counterterrorism and counterpolarization unit within the security directorate of the city of The Hague. City of The Hague is the government capital of the Netherlands. It's not the actual capital, that would be Amsterdam. Although here in The Hague, people seem to think, especially my organization, that being a government capital is much more important anyway. But being the government capital means we are the seat of the parliament. All the government organizations are located here in our city, and it's also, as a result of that, the city where we have many embassies and a lot of headquarters of international organizations. We have formally labeled ourselves, you could say, but already going back a couple of centuries, as the city of peace and justice, the seat of the International Criminal Court, the Peace Palace, and hence also home to many organizations related to those two labels, peace and justice, whether it's international think tanks, international scientific institutes, and so on. So we basically have very large expat and migrant communities here in the city as well. And all those things, that kind of provides the context for the topic of today. I think, Joel, when you presented on the report, I heard you mention something about hot periods that you've identified. Well, I can safely say that I think we as a city, and many cities around the world, have been going through what feels like a very prolonged hot period of, well, when it comes to anti-institutional, anti-minority, and basically all kinds of demonstrations. I want to give you a bit of background of what we've been dealing with in the Netherlands, in The Hague, and that goes for many more cities in the Netherlands, and also with what are some of the remaining difficulties or dilemmas we face, as well as what are some of the lessons we have learned that we believe are worthwhile mentioning. In our city, we have over 1,200 demonstrations a year, so that comes down to multiple demonstrations every single day. And some of those are large-scale demonstrations attracting thousands or millions of people from all over the Netherlands and sometimes even internationally. But many are also very small-scale demonstrations, sometimes taking place every week, for example. What we've seen, especially with the rise of COVID and anti-COVID policies, so in the past 2 years roughly, is a rise in the fluidity of demonstrations and protests in two ways. On the one hand, we've seen a merit of many groups that you would almost see as very unlikely bed partners when it comes to demonstrations and protests. Often these groups do not share anything that they are in favor of with one another, but they do share what they are against. And what they are against has for a long time been dubbed in the Netherlands as anti-government, so being against the government. But it's much broader than that. Mike also mentioned already, it's effectively anti-institutionalism. So often these demonstrations, whether they are violent or not, turn very clearly against government officials, politicians, but also academic institutes, also what is labeled here as the mainstream media, and in a very real sense as well, sometimes resulting in physical threats. Mike also mentioned politicians, those having public office facing people in front of their houses, sometimes not necessarily violent, in behaving in violent manners, but very much clearly in intimidating ways, whether it's waving flags, shouting at family members, just being there in the streets on a daily basis sometimes. We've seen a rise of that fluidity in groups, and well, we've seen that, for example, we've seen a very clear mixture of right-wing extremist groups with right-wing groups, which makes sense, but then also mixing sometimes with, for example, conspiracy thinkers, but also, for example, Black Lives Matters groups mixing with Antifa, but then also with the same conspiracy thinkers that also show up in some of these right-wing movement protests. So fluidity in groups. And the second trend that we've seen over the past 2 years is a rise in behaviors that can be labeled as undesirable, as clearly undermining democracy and the rule of law, that can maybe even be labeled as extremist, but that are clearly not illegal or violent. I think, Joel, you mentioned that too, somewhere in your presentation, that often it isn't necessarily violence that demonstrations or forms of protest end with, but we do definitely see a very, in my opinion, shocking rise in the undermining of democracy, the undermining of the rule of law, the undermining of trust in government generally and trust in institutions. I think that's a global trend, but it's really accelerated over the past 2 years. And that also brings me to what do we do about it, and what I think is the main challenge we face here in The Hague and worldwide. And we've always had what we call a three-pronged approach to countering polarization, hate, radicalization, extremism. So basically anything within that large domain that consists of, first and foremost, dialogue. Second, confrontation, and the underlying idea is you can only confront individuals or communities or organizations if you actually know who these people are and already have established dialogue with them. And third, law enforcement, or enforcement generally where necessary. It's kind of like an escalation ladder, you could say. Well, and that sounds all very well, you could say, on paper, but it kind of applies nicely if you look at how these kind of movements and this societal discontent can escalate in practice. But what we've seen in the past 2 years is that when, whether it's a demonstration or whether it's unannounced protest, when it ends in illegal activities, including, for example, violence, then there's a very clear framework for how to deal with that. We deal with it through police, through general prosecutors, through law enforcement. And also when it comes to the preventative side, when it comes to the rise of polarization, I think in the Netherlands we've established quite a good approach to generic prevention almost, a bit specifically targeting specific communities, specific age groups, for example. So one practical example is we're investing heavily within the city of The Hague on teaching kids in high schools how to deal with social media, how to determine what is a fact and what is not, and what it means when you, for example, forward a message. Does it mean that you support the message? And well, how do you deal with this whole online environment? So I think on the two ends of the spectrum, so escalation, especially into illegal activities, including violence, and broad prevention, I think we're on the right track. But when it comes to the dilemmas we're still facing and the difficulties, and also what we're looking around for to other cities, to academia, for input is especially how to deal with that in-between area. You can call it, on the one hand, the extremist area, but not necessarily violent extremism. And that includes questions such as how do you talk to conspiracy thinkers, or maybe even taking it one step earlier, should you establish dialogue with conspiracy thinkers to begin with? So, for example, I heard you say, Mike, as well, it's very important to always keep open lines of communication with all parties. We have a way of doing that, especially when they formally sign up for a demonstration, for example. But if these organizers of a demonstration are very clear conspiracy thinkers, then that also brings with it all kinds of questions and risks. For example, if you would reach out to them as a government official, they might be already very much pitted against government. They might record the people who you send out to talk to them. Is it even worthwhile to attempt to talk to them? I would argue it's always worthwhile to be in dialogue, but nonetheless, well, how do you deal with conspiracies? I think we're only just starting to learn what is and isn't possible in that area. Another difficult dilemma is who are the credible voices talking to different groups, especially those large groups that seem to share distrust in government generally. How do you establish credible voices? And finally, one big issue we're facing is information sharing. Again, especially when it comes to individuals or groups who are not committing illegal activities, so who are not involved in illegal activities. We are literally having discussions with the police about should they be able to send us pictures of individuals who are participating in demonstrations and who can be seen in multiple demonstrations all the time, who are maybe intimidating others. But if the government were to be seen as gathering information on demonstrators or protesters, that's also a big political risk and something you need to think about very carefully. So information sharing, what is and isn't possible between intel agencies, between police, between people working for local government is a big dilemma, I think. What I wanted to end with, a couple of lessons learned. First and foremost, very much in line with what you were saying as well, Mike, the importance of transparency about what also local government, what municipalities are and are not, and what they can and cannot do, especially from some of the talks I've had with some individuals who were also adopting conspiracy theories. I sometimes thought to myself, if only we were that effective as government, if only we were able to have such large-scale operations as some people seem to think we are able to. So being much more transparent also about the fact that building coalitions and that making policy always falls 2 to 3 steps and days, often weeks behind events that are unfolding in real time. Transparency is crucial. And second, the local approach. I think I cannot stress that enough. In the end, the distrust that I think many of us see in our local communities very much focus on what is perceived of as national elites, sometimes also local or provincial or federal elites, but very much focused on people who are perceived as quite distant, people whose faces you do not see in the street, who you cannot reach out to have a personal conversation with. And that is why I think it's all the more important that it is the most local level possible that is at the forefront of having that dialogue with the communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much again for a very insightful reflection on how to deal with some of these issues and actionable lessons learned that come out of that. Now I will pass on to Paul Mentz. Paul?
Thank you for inviting me. It was really insightful so far to see kind of a perspective from a more official viewpoint. What I'm going to present is a presentation more from a prevention work that is in the structure of an NGO or a multi-agency working context. I'm sorry that I can't speak for Chemnitz. I think that would have been more interesting to some people because it was part of the study. Dortmund is very different if we consider Chemnitz and Dortmund. Dortmund has a far more diverse population. That also includes a larger potential for opposition to far-right extremism, but also a larger amount of people within the city that are potential targets. Our city has a long history of right-wing extremism. Just to understand where I'm coming from, it mostly targeted over the year, if we exclude right-wing terrorism, if we're just speaking on violence created on the ground by the movement, it mostly targets a political opposition. And in some cases, especially in protests against Israel, also a strong anti-Semitic sentiment that has boiled over in violence. We have had cases over the year of massive outbreaks of organized violence against political opposition. We had an attack by literally hundreds of neo-Nazis on the May 1st labor demonstration in Dortmund a couple of years, or a lot of, I think it's probably now 15 years ago or 20. And we also had an attack on Town Hall where right-wing extremists tried to gain access to City Hall after an election. At this point, a lot of neo-Nazis from Dortmund, far-right activists, are actually moving towards the east, heading for Chemnitz. And we have to say our once very influential right-wing extremist far-right scene is now very marginalized. And that changes quite a few things. What remains is a scene that is very strong in kind of approaching things from a strategic standpoint. So if we look at our history, we have different settings. We used to have a strong mobilization, even at an international level. And now we have a marginalized movement. And I'm going to try to focus a little bit. I know a lot of ends will there will be a lot of open ends and questions, but I'm going to focus on what the study kind of called the difference between or the paradox between, on the one hand, marginalized movements becoming more violent, and on the other side, emboldened movements that have broader public support or believe they have broader public support, that these are the two kinds of settings that create violence. Having a marginalized movement, we can actually affirm that random acts of violence are growing. We have far more cases of random acts of violence than when the scene was stronger or better organized. But what I'm going to try to focus on, I think actually it's not that much a paradox. I actually think there is a strategic dilemma, and if a scene is, has a certain strategic outlook and ideology they want to follow, what they will do, and when they are marginalized, they will try to latch on to broader movements, larger movements, movements with more support in the population to gain to a certain level acceptance of the violent approaches. Their attachment to larger movements usually, and in Dortmund we can see that very clearly, is based on overlapping grievances or overlapping enemies or actually ideology. There are two groups that neo-Nazis or far-right in Germany can associate with. The one would be the AfD, the right-wing populist party that legitimizes violence that is pretty close in ideology, but the AfD in Dortmund is pretty marginalized, so they try to latch on. They're meeting with each other, but it doesn't really have that much of meaning. On the other hand, we have the anti-COVID protests. I'll call that the protest against the anti-COVID measures the government has installed. And I think that's really the point where we can see on a broader spectrum how they can latch onto a movement and try to become the avant-garde of a movement that actually accepts the measures of violence, but at the same hand, how we can prevent this of happening. Because these movements have certain similarities and overlapping ideas. In this case, we have already spoken about it, conspiracy theories, the idea that they are part of a majority that is being oppressed by a minority that has access to media and to other public spheres. We have a strong anti-government sentiment, questioning the legitimacy of the government and the measures taking place at that time. We have a call for social change. That's very important. We have certain groups that are on the fringes of society, but are trying to, by combining their efforts, become a mainstream movement, a strong mainstream movement. We have a potentially revolutionary agenda that considers its acts as self-defense against the authoritarian regime. And they both believe far-right activists and anti-COVID activists that they are an avant-garde for social change. So these are things that they can latch onto and kind of become part of the movement and act in a violent way towards opposition of this movement if things work out in their favor. There are also differences, but it's really important to remember the differences I'm speaking about are not general differences. They're differences in the way people that are not part of the far right perceive their movement. And that would be, they label things different. They think, and they are to a certain degree, a very diverse movement by people in a lot of cases in individual crisis, fearing for the future, uncertainty regarding their perspectives. They have underlying grievances that have more to do with their individual crisis than being a political movement. They believe to a certain degree that they are the true proponents of the Constitution. So that is something that is different to traditional and to the far right. They believe they're kind of standing for the last vanguard of freedom. They believe they are speaking for a majority of people and for true democracy. And they would, and this is kind of similar to what Putin is doing at the moment, they would call themselves anti-Nazi activists and consider the government not neo-Nazis or Nazis, and whatever violence they have to use against the government as anti-fascist violence, which has a difficulty for certain Nazis. So why isn't this important to kind of think about this? If we look overall on different movements, people can come together at a very low level of agreeing on certain points, and that would be being pro-violent measures against the government and that they consider fascist or authoritarian. If we look at the group that tried to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, we have people who took part in Black Lives Matter demonstrations. We had people on the rooftop planning on shooting Black Lives Matter activists if they would try to infringe with stores or other things. So we have people that have very different views, but are willing to come together in a violent atmosphere or with violent goals that they try to achieve over the things or over their overlapping interests. So what they try to do and what the right-wing extremists do or the far right does, they try to create a framework that legitimizes their violence. And how do they do it? They need, and this is necessary, and that's what they try to create. They try to create an atmosphere of a perceived threat, either from political opposition or through the state, considering in this case the police, or they can hope for a real attack, a serious attack from the government or from political opposition. Their goal is kind of to find a way to escalate. So what we have is that they create a certain kind of victimhood, which is necessary for them to act. What we can do, I believe, and just make it short, we can exercise and exploit these differences. And how can we do it? We can make clear to the movement that these people are Nazis, violent Nazis. This can have bizarre kind of results with a demonstration in front. People have a banner, "We are against Nazis." In the back, there are Nazis moving along with the movement. We can discuss with people within this movement about underlying grievances and how to distance themselves from Nazis, which keeps this movement from acting in a violent way. These are different things we can do and try to create a backlash within the movement against Nazis within the movement, so they are not able to take over this movement. We'll probably face more of this in the future, especially when we look at probably out of necessity or out of fear, a growing pro-European nationalism, considering the threat from Russia, and also on the other hand, pro-Putin, probably pro-Russian movement within the fringes or of society and within the anti-COVID movement or the anti-COVID measure movement. And I think there will be similar attempts by the extreme right to kind of take over these movements, and it will be important to engage with them. We will also have to engage with them on different levels, but just the first step to prevent violence would probably be to isolate and kind of make clear who you're dealing with, that you're dealing with neo-Nazis that are not necessarily in any way sharing certain self-perceived goals these movements have. So I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm going to leave it there, but thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all our panelists, and of course to Joel at the start for his presentation. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. I know that we're running relatively short on time, so I'll jump straight into those. I guess we'll start. Question for you, Mike, on what you felt was the most challenging aspect of responding to the Unite the Right rally.
I'm sorry that my morning office light in the early morning always looks like this, especially as spring comes on. So I'm going to try to duck out so you guys can see me. I think, and I'm speaking from an American context, the most challenging part is the labyrinth that the First Amendment requires cities go through in America. I wrote about this extensively in my book, Cry Havoc, Charlottesville and American Democracy Under Siege. If anybody's interested in it, maybe we pop it in the chat. And it's a quite, I think, obviously we mentioned it, it was referred to in the report, but it goes at length into how we got where we are in First Amendment law and how it applies to cities. But the Supreme Court's concern a long time ago was that cities would abuse their authority if you had, for instance, disrupting the peace ordinances, where you could stop an event if the local authorities determined that it would disrupt the peace. Obviously, a very vague thing to prevent. And in the United States, because of the incredibly strong free speech tradition we have, going back to John Stuart Mill and John Milton, and it just, it's called free speech absolutism, and it's basically the prevailing rule of the land. Although I think it's changing a little bit, in part because of what happened in Charlottesville. But unless you have a piece of evidence that is written down or that you can hear, where there is a planned specific incitement to or planning of an imminent unlawful act, that speech is protected. And not only protected, there generally is a presumption that the government should facilitate its hearing because it's unpopular actual political speech. And political speech is more protected than a lot of other kinds of speech. So it creates an enormous conundrum for governments. There are a couple of corollaries to this, where one of them is called the Heckler's veto. So local government action that would allow somebody heckling an event to cancel it is extremely disfavored. So this, for instance, put us in the situation when we're talking about everything we are here, where if you have a group of white nationalists coming to the city, Antifa is also coming to the city. Everybody says Antifa is going to make this event dangerous because they're going to get so out of control, and they're going to be using their bodies, and they're going to be doing direct action, and they'll be attacking police, and they'll be creating mayhem. The Supreme Court says that sounds like a heckler's veto to us. It sounds like you're allowing Antifa to cancel the event by protesting it. What if the shoe were on the other foot? What if it was a Black Lives Matter event and a bunch of right wingers were coming and saying, you're going to make us out of our minds. We can't control ourselves. We're going to make the event violent. The Supreme Court says we can't let, in either case, the protests shut down the event or heckling, vetoing it. The other thing is that because the mesh that they have put in place to filter speech and find just those little nuggets of actual credible threats is what a planned, specific, imminent, unlawful act. It's almost impossible to get those, because all you have to do if you're the plotter behind one of these events is tack on something that makes it seem defensive. So this literally was the case in Charlottesville. If somebody wrote a post on a platform that said, I'm going to bash Antifa's skulls in if they attack me, that's protected speech because it has a defensive context. And there's also Supreme Court law that says that general statements approbating violence are constitutionally protected. So if I say that Jewish mayor, we ought to bring back the gas chambers, no problem with that. That's free speech. It's a general statement of support for general violence. It has to be specific. If I said, I'm going to take him down to this burn pit that I prepared tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning and bound and gag him and burn him alive, that would not be okay. The FBI would be involved with that, and I would be able to call the police. But this got very tricky, both managing and applying those tests and explaining them to the public. It was miserable. And it was hard to know whether to give too much information. And then I seemed like, a law professor who was on the side of these hate groups, or whether you give too little information and then you're not explaining to the public why the police is hosting hate groups. And I chose to, do the former and explain what the law was and explain that there was no prohibition on hate groups in the United States. Hate speech was absolutely protected. We were going to set the conditions for safety, and we weren't going to allow protesters to shut down the events. But that was very, very hard. And then the other hard part was, once the hate speech actually was going to create an environment, though, even their intent was to create mayhem and have the groups basically fight each other like gangs on the street. They wanted there to be assaults and batteries. They just weren't going to write that specifically in a way that the Supreme Court would allow. I think that the courts need a new test which basically admits more evidence into about intentional mayhem, intending for there to be a situation that you plan where there will be inevitable physical conflict, and local government should be able to stop that. I think stop the event from happening if that's the intent, even if it's not breaking a law per se.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just because I'm mindful of time, I'll just draw out one more question, but we will save all of the other questions we've received and then follow up with everyone that's attended with some responses. I guess this one is for Joel and Gareth. Any suggestions on how local government, and I guess beyond that, practitioners, local leaders, etc., can work in partnership to manage risk among both the marginalized pathway that you mentioned and then the emboldened pathway to violence that you mentioned?
Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks for the question. In some ways, this is something that we're working towards at the moment, and Gareth might have stuff to pitch in, but just, I suppose, a couple of very quick thoughts. In terms of the movement emboldened pathway, the key thing there is about undermining that perception that there's that wider support. Yeah. And then that's the case of working with that wider set of partners who might be generating that impression. Whereas, to pick up on something that Paul was raising, I think within the movement marginalized pathway, I think there are perhaps more opportunities looking at the intra-movement dynamics and splits and divisions within the movements and the dynamics within those movements. But Gareth, I see you're unmuted, so.
I'd agree with that second point, exactly as Paul said. Although we are talking, ISD, you've recently published something on the hybrid threat picture, and this specifically talks about the overlaps between anti-minority groups, conspiracy theorists, Although there is a coalescing around certain key narratives, there's also big divisions. And actually what goes in our favour is most of these discussions around strategy and these divisions are played out publicly on channels on Telegram. So we actually, for academics and practitioners, we actually get a window on this. So you can actually look at what the divisions are. I mean, anti-Semitism is a big division currently within the UK scene. So there are ways to work on these, these offer you certain levers into these movements and to break away the more radical flanks from the more moderate.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on that question on local government working to mitigate risks of escalations to violence. Otherwise, I will leave it at that. Perfect. Thank you all so much. As I said, we will save the rest of the questions and answer them via email. Oh, Mike, I see that you unmuted. Did you want to add anything?
Oh, no.
Okay, no problem. So to close the session, I want to thank our amazing speakers again. Thank you, Joel, for taking us through your research, and Gareth for being on hand to answer some of the questions. I saw that you answered some in the chat as well. And thank you, of course, to Michael, Lisbeth, and Paul for your very important reflections and inputs on this topic and on the role of different local actors and so forth to address this topic. Before I close, I just very quickly want to take the opportunity to highlight our next webinar, which takes place next week, Thursday, the 17th of March, co-hosted with Nordic Safe Cities. And that webinar, titled Safeguarding Local Democracies, Countering Foreign Interference and Online Misinformation, will examine both the kind of physical and digital world and the interconnectivity between the two, and what cities can do to prevent polarization in both those spheres and to prevent hate speech and threats towards minorities, etc. I think my colleagues have posted the links to register in the chat. There's also another webinar on the 7th of April, again with Nordic Safe Cities, on safe city governments and the role of networks and alliances to facilitate that. All right. So thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining. We really appreciate your time and we hope that you found this useful. I found it very useful. I have a lot of questions for follow-up. And if you have any other questions that you would like us to pose to our cohort of speakers today and answer via email, please let us know via info@strongcitiesnetwork.org. And yes, I will now close the session. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thanks.